Yes, it is true. The ecstatic cannot say the unsayable. They speak, they must speak, because the word burns inside them, around the driving conflagration which remains in them as the sole trace of the experience. They would like to stop themselves and cannot. They feel the impossibility of saying it, like a 7-locked gate which they rattle, knowing that it will never open. Yet, they must go on rattling it, for the word burns in them. Ecstasy is dead, stabbed in the back by time, which will not be mocked. But dying, it has flung the word into them, and the word burns in them. They know that they cannot say it, yet they try over and over again until their soul is exhausted to death, and the word leaves them. And yet, the ecstatic's will to say is more than mere impotence and stammering. It is also might and mastery. They want to create a memorial for ecstasy which leaves no traces, to tow the timeless into the harbor of time. They want to make the unity without multiplicity into the unity of all multiplicity. The thought of the Great Myth Awakens. A thought which runs through all time of humanity. The myth of unity which becomes plurality because it wants to gaze and be gazed at, to know and be known, to love and be loved, and which, while itself remaining unity, embraces itself as multiplicity, of the I which begets a thou, of the primal self which transforms itself into the world, of divinity which transforms itself into God. Is the myth proclaimed by the Vedas and Upanishads, Medrash and Kabbalah, Plato and Jesus, not the symbol of what the ecstatic has experienced? Did not the masters of all times who created and recreated it again and again draw on their own experience? And so it guided them to insert the experience, not as an event in the commotion, nor as a report in the intelligence of time, but to put it into the deed of their lives, to work it into their work, to make of it the new poem of the primal myth, and thus place it not as a thing amongst things here on earth, but as a star amid the stars of heaven. That delightful, delicious quote is from Mordechai Buber, Modern Buber, the German Jewish philosopher, in a book that he wrote called Ecstatic Confessions, one of his early works, where he delves into the mystical. And in it he encapsulates what I believe is a brilliant and beautiful formulation, not only of the struggle that the mystic has to try and put their experience into words, to try and tow the timeless into the harbor of time, as he so eloquently puts it, but the very encapsulation of the metamyth of all the world's mystics, of unity which becomes plurality because it wants to gaze and be gazed at, to know and be known, to love and be loved. I think these words ring true across traditions, and each person hearing them from their own religious vantage point will hear glimmers of their own wisdom reflected therein, and hopefully even some of their own soul. Of unity which remains itself unity while embracing itself as multiplicity, of the I which becomes a thou, a you, of a primal self which transforms itself into the world. Modern Buber here, in his early mystical days, is expressing this prime myth of the self that transforms itself into multiplicity, into the world as we know it, into the manifestations, the manifold, so that it can come to embrace itself. This really is the story, and I was going to save this quote and story for the end, but I thought that we should start with this story and then explain why we need this story and what purpose we have for it today. The title of this little fun hangout, and I hope to get to hear from some of you soon, is Mysticism for the Modern World, an exploration of the unity of experience, theory, and practice in the world's mystical traditions, a universal spirituality, a mysticism which transcends all boundaries while being deeply rooted in tradition, and all these words here are chosen quite carefully, exploring an upgraded operating system for religion and life, a rationally empirically, scientifically, and philosophically sound approach to mysticism, which might just redeem us and teach us how to live more beautiful lives. It's very clear from anyone who studies history, religion, sociology, or any other field, that the experience of the mystical is one which is common and ubiquitous to humans across time, across ages. The challenge is that the experience is a fleeting one. It's an experience which we find not the tools to put into words. We rattle against it as the word is flung into us, but we are exhausted in our attempt to try and put it into practice because of how elusive and how difficult and how alienated it is from the world that we live in. The great mystics, writes Buber, are those who are able to take the word and not only articulate the great myth of all time, but to put it into deed, into practice, into their lives. Many of us here can sit and talk about what the myth is, but for those of us that can put it into practice, those words speak the loudest. There's a really wonderful quote from Salman Rushdie, who speaks about the purpose of art. Art is defined by Dostoevsky as the attempt to capture a certain feeling which the artist had and to convey that, whether it be in a painting, in a novel, in a quartet, a piece of music. And Rushdie writes in similar lines to Dostoevsky. He writes that the visionary or mystical experience does not last very long. It's fleeting. William James calls it that which is transient and passing, one of the 4 characteristics that he gives the mystical experience. And Rushdie says that it is for art to capture that experience, to offer it to a secular, materialistic culture as some sort of replacement for the love of God offered in a time of faith. Rushdie, analyzing the present moment with a brilliance that only great novelists like he can, sees that we live in a time of secular materialism, which has the capacity to lead us into lives of separation and alienation, in competition with one another, and not seeing the big picture, the big myth of how we're connected, what may have been provided by a love of God in times of faith, as he puts it. Although, to be fair, love of God in times of faith also had the power to separate and divide people. But it is the mystical which brings people together, and we'll speak about that, and we'll speak about why that's the case, which is fleeting. It's a powerful experience. Modern scientific studies show that the transformative power of the mystical experience is ranked in the top 5 experiences of one's life, and the lasting impacts, whether that's attempts to deal with addiction, to change some characteristics or habits which are guiding our lives in directions we don't want them, mystical experience can be a tremendously transformative experience, and there are some scholars who see the transformative power as definitional to the mystical experience, John Vervaeke, for example, amongst others. But because it is fleeting, it is hard for us to encapsulate and hard for us to bring into our lives. It is therefore the role of art, be it visionary, musically, literary art, to take that and to bring it into our lives. And what I would like to try and engage with you here is the art of conversation and the art of dialogue, to try and bring the mystical, to try and speak that reality into our lives. And hopefully, if we speak about it enough and speak about it in conversation and listen as we speak, it can begin to drip in and make its way slowly and permeate our lives. It's really no surprise that we live in a time of crisis and alienation. You don't have to spend more than 3 minutes on Twitter to see the state of the world that we live in. A world which is really burning and only exasperated by the tools at our hands, the media and technology which fuel the flames. But a burning world, although it seems like a modern predicament, a predicament of secularism and materialism, as Rushdie puts it, it's actually a very old predicament. There's something in the human nature itself which is burning, the conflagration, as Buber put it. And when we see the world through our own eyes, as we must, as we know from Immanuel Kant, we see a burning world. There's a beautiful medrash from Bereshit Rabbah 39:1, which I'm sure many here already are familiar with, of a certain fellow who's passing. He's walking from place to place through a field, and he sees that there's a building in the field, and the building is burning. This is a text from 2,000 years ago. And he comes close to this burning fire, this theme of people being drawn to fire like Moses being drawn to the burning bush. And he asks himself, in the dialogue with the Medrash, we hear his voice out loud, saying, "Where is the owner of this house to extinguish the burning flame?" He says, Ha'im yesh balabayis lebirazu, is there an owner, is there a house master to this building? And the Medrash says that God, God's self, peers out from between the flames, betwixt the flames, as it might be translated. And God says, yes, there is a balabayis. The balabayis is I, and I need you. I need you, Adam. I need you, Sarah. I need you, Moses. I need you, Joshua, Rebecca, Jacob, Stephen, Anthony, Zevi, Alyssa, Martin Buber, whatever your name is. I need you to come and put out the fire with me. This is the partnership that God puts Adam into the world for, Adam and Eve, la'avdoi l'shamar, to both work the land and protect the land. And God, it seemingly creates God's own limits on God's omnipotence. God's power is also capable of reducing its own power and making God a finite God, as William James would have us believe, and calls the human in God's own finitude to come and help God put out the fire. It's very clear that our world is shaped by narratives. It is shaped by the stories that we tell. We humans are a storytelling primate. We must tell stories. The question is, what stories are we telling ourselves? And what stories can we be telling ourselves to be serving a better purpose? The story of corporate greed and capitalism and the need to succeed at the expense of others is clearly a very bad story. It's an empirically bad story because it doesn't line up with the facts. When we help each other, when we help our communities grow, when we engage in not just private entrepreneurship, but social entrepreneurship, we benefit as a result, and this is what the numbers show. And it's a bad story because it's a story which leaves us, even if on the outside we may be successful by some sort of vain metric, by what car we're driving or how many digits there are on the bank account, it leaves us existentially empty and wanting. And we all know that a time comes when we will be put into a small wooden box and lowered down into the ground. And in there, we don't take our debit cards, our credit cards, our Mercedes and BMWs. We live in a short-sightedness of the death that awaits us, of that great respite at the end of days, which the Zohar says is a pleasure for the tzaddik, for the righteous, and a pain for the wicked, because the wicked is clinging on to their own, into their small little identities, their small little bank accounts, the things which they can hold against themselves from the storm of existential dread. The righteous, potentially each one of us in moments of clarity, can realize what it is that we want to be pursuing in life and let go of those small stories, those small conceptions of self and reality which keep us trapped. And I think the role of storytelling here is an important one. I spend most of my time reading philosophers, and they can be very boring, particularly metaphysicians, some of my favorite people, but can be terribly boring. Storytellers is not just something for kindergartens and for libraries. I think that philosophy must be done as a form of storytelling. And some of the greatest philosophers were storytellers, whether that's people like Nietzsche or Plato, who told us stories. The Arizal, who tells us a story, a cosmic story, or Martin Buber, who recapitulates that story as he sees it moving through time. And I want to invite us here in conversation together to think about what stories are we telling ourselves every single day, every single moment of our lives, when we wake up first thing in the morning, when we go to bed at night. What stories are we telling our children and our friends and our strangers? What stories are we telling in the actions that we perpetuate? What stories are we living, in effect? We live in what's been called an age of superstition and uncertainty. The hermeneutics of superstition is the fancy term given to it, whether it's a result of Marx, Freud, or Nietzsche, or Ricoeur, Gadamer, or Habermas in the field of hermeneutics. In a time of deconstruction, be it at the hands of Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, whoever you want to blame for the deconstruction, but there's some sort of fundamental uncertainty, not just in the humanities, but also in the sciences, in Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or in Russell's paradox, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem in mathematics. A plug pulled at the bedrock of our certainty. Whatever we thought we could build up in the Enlightenment with human reason seems, in every field, to be falling between our fingers like dry sand. You can notice that I just told a story here about the moment that we're in. But the popularities of these ideas, these narratives of uncertainty, they speak to something human in the moment. They speak to a real uncertainty about the purpose of existence, where we're going, why we're here at all. they tell a joke to lighten things up a little of a pilot whose radio's back into the radio tower. And they say, "Hey, Captain, how's it going out there?" And he says, "You know, I'm making really, really good time. My fuel's really high. The wind's behind me, but I have no idea where I'm heading." And sometimes it does feel like that in life, that we're doing great, things are working out, numbers are looking good, but we don't really know where we're heading. And we need a story to tell us where we're heading. We need a framework with which we can understand reality, a guide to our steps, and a lead for our actions. And if it's going to be a story that will work, it will have to be a kind story, a soft story, a gentle story. And the bones of this story, I believe, exist in the depths of our own truths, our own experiences. I believe they exist in the words of the mystics, who are speaking from the depths of their own deepest experiences when they can. Beneath our most reified theoretical constructions, our craziest metaphysics, if you come hang out on the channel at Seekers of Unity, we talk about a lot of really crazy theoretical metaphysics, but beneath all these metaphysics, there is a deep perceptual feeling for the way things are and the way things can be. And when we tap into the way things are and the way things can be at the deepest level of self, we have an invitation to radically rethink the way that we live our lives, to take a moment to slow down. And this really is the role of philosophy, to slow us down, to stop us in our tracks, to hold back that plane that's flying at the speed of light to God knows where, to think about why are we doing the things that we're doing in our days. And we may realize that a lot of them are pointless, are meaningless. They're not taking us to where we want to actually be. That we're preparing for some moment to come in the future when the future never comes. We only ever get to live the moment. We have a tremendous amount of unfounded assumptions and decisions based on pride and ego. And if we chose to shift the narrative, and this narrative that we're building here together slowly, we can choose to live our lives instead from a place of humility, of simplicity, contentment, in a way that I think would be better off for if not most of us, for all of us, or if not for all of us, then most of us. You know, there's a great quote from the Buddha who was asked after years of meditating, what did he gain? Because there were a lot of things that he gave up. You know, he was, according to some stories, he was a prince, and he gave up wealth and safety and security and women, and the prestige and the pride that came with being a prince. And they asked him, what did you gain by coming here and living in a robe under the Bodhi tree? And he said, I didn't gain anything, but I lost some things. And everyone thought that they knew what he was talking about. He said, what I lost was anxiety and guilt and animosity and jealousy and strife. And these are the things that I lost. And he continued to list on and on. And I don't mean to say that in a moment we're going to overnight all become Buddhas. Enlightened beings, literally the translation, awakened beings. And I think there's a potential for a negative positivity that as soon as we change our fundamental narrative, we upgrade our operating system, all of a sudden all of our anxieties and guilts and fears disappear. I don't think that's the case. But I think that we can begin to tell a new story to ourselves, and we can work with that story, and there may be years, maybe one lifetime or more of work to integrate that story into our reality and into the world around us. And instead of being people that are working jobs that we don't actually enjoy, to buy things we don't actually need, to impress people that we don't actually like, to quote Fight Club, we can instead live lives from places of deep meaning and satisfaction, from lives of chosen simplicity, lives of unity, lives of love. A good story well told, said someone once, can change the world. What I'd like to try and do with the remainder of our time here is to try and figure out what the story of the mystics is, to try and define mysticism at its core, to try and figure out what it is, and secondly, to try and see how and why and where mysticism, this story that we're prodding towards, might be relevant in our lives today here in 2022. Part of the problem of trying to get a good story out of mysticism is that there really is no scholarly consensus on what mysticism itself means. Gershon Shalom, the famous scholar of Jewish mysticism, said that there are as many definitions of mysticism as there are scholars on the subject, each one bringing their own definition to play. And when most people hear the word mysticism, and this is part of the challenge that we're fighting fighting is a bit of an aggressive word. Part of the challenge that we're pushing against on the Seekers of Unity project is that most people, when they hear the word mysticism, they think of something nebulous, misty, esoteric, occult, supernatural. And these are certainly not what's meant by mysticism. I'd like to introduce you to a new definition of mysticism. And when we begin to work with these new definitions, you see sometimes the light bulb go off in people's eyes and say, oh, that's what I've been interested in or exploring all along. I just didn't know there was a name for it. And giving names to things is important. It's what Adam does in the Garden of Eden. He gives names to the animals around him. And not in an attempt to conquer or to dominate or to impose some sort of patriarchal agenda upon nature, to divide and categorize it, but instead to come into a relationship with something. When we call something by name, we're in relationship with it. The fox in The Little Prince tells the little prince to call me by my name, that you may own me, that we may be in relationship with one another. That is the beauty of calling something by its name. So let us try and call this thing by its name, mysticism, and figure out what mysticism is. Sounds good? Okay. Evelyn Underhill, an Anglican scholar who wrote one of the most influential works on mysticism in the past century for a public audience, titled Mysticism, defined mysticism a few different ways throughout her writings. She wrote another book called Practical Mysticism, a bit shorter, a bit easier, and some different definitions. But the most beautiful definition that I found in her writings was that mysticism, it's very short, so if you blink, you'll miss it. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. That's it. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. Now, there's a bit of a debate whether reality should be spelled with a capital R or lowercase r. Capital R indicates the divine God. But we'll put that aside for a second. The art of union with reality. So as opposed to mysticism being something about escapism, escaping from reality, escaping from our lives, union with reality. I think the term spirituality often can unfortunately lead itself into its own duality, where the spirituality, is contrasted with matter, materiality. Spirituality and materialism, spirit and matter, the classic dichotomy of the Greeks, form and matter, idios and hule. But mysticism is not that. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. It's a bit more of an elaborated definition from a really wonderful scholar, Peter Moore. He says that mysticism, and we open with this definition, if you remember, mysticism is three things, which are all really bundled into one. It's not really fair to separate them into three, but for the sake of thinking and naming it, it may help us. Mysticism is unitive experiences, unitive theories or beliefs, and unitive practices. Let's do that slowly. Unitive experience. There are all kinds of experiences in our lives. We're experiencing all the time. But generally, when we're experiencing the world around us, we're experiencing in a way that is broken, that is separate, that is fragmented. There's us and them. There's me and you. There's subject and object. These are all the dualities, the multiplicities that we engage in our ordinary reality. What the Kabbalists call the alma de pruda, the fractured world. But then there are moments, and they can be visionary, they can be ecstatic, they can be contemplative, or they can be simply unitive, silent moments, where we sense that beneath the multiplicity of reality, beneath the separation, the bifurcation, the fragmentation, there lies a deeper wholeness to reality, an interconnectedness, a unity, where the boundaries of the self melt away, where we can experience the oneness of being, the wahdat al-wujud, to quote Ibn Arabi, the Muslim Sufi mystic. While we're splitting things, unitive experiences, I think, can be divided into two. There's two sides of this, and I think this is a theme that you see across many traditions, and an important one to notice. On the first half, and there are two halves of one coin, don't think these are two separate things. The first half of the coin is an experience of dissolution, an experience of nullification, abnegation, bittul in Hebrew, fana in Islam, crucifixion in Christianity. An experience where we let go of the self that we thought we were. It can be a painful experience. It can feel like we're being torn apart. But there's a necessity in that process to let go of who we thought we were, to die to who we were, so that we can be reborn on the other side of the experience. After bittul comes dveikos, comes hiskalalus, comes a cleaving or a unity with God. After fana comes bak'ah for the Muslim, comes the ability to stand in the presence of God and experience the oneness. After crucifixion for the Christian mystics comes the mystical reading of resurrection, where that we can be resurrected into our new self after samsara and nirvana. So the experience, I think, has these two sides to them. The way that the human brain, and this, I think, I'm not a neuroscientist, but we have our neurological patterns that keep us telling us the narratives of who we are, and those keep us sane in the world, and they're important. But we have to, in safe moments and safe spaces, allow those patterns, those neural pathways to dissolve, to go through a bittle, so they can be rebuilt and reconstructed with new narratives, ones which are more beautiful and more unitive. This is a biological process. The seed, and this is a metaphor which mystics of all traditions bring, the seed must be put in the ground and dissolve before it can sprout into a huge almond tree with beautiful blossoms come spring. If the seed holds on to its small self, it says, no, keep me in a dry vacuum container so that I never let go of myself, then it will never become an almond blossom and give seed forward. And those are the two sides of the experience, the rotting of the seed, jXaviErre sagarin, as the mystics call it in Judaism and Hebrew, and then the flowering. Then there are the theories of unity. So once we've had these unitive experiences, which current studies show them to be a lot more popular and a lot more pervasive than we once thought them to be. 3 out of 5 Americans in one poll came out. Psychedelic experiences are triggering these experiences, psychedelic substances rather, are triggering these experiences for many, many people across the world. Whether that's the best way to get there or not is a topic for another discussion. I think that let's leave that for now. There are unitive theories. Theories can come in all shapes and sizes, and we've had theories since the beginning of time. Theories of how we make sense of that radically beautiful unitive moment, or terrifying unitive moment. Rudolf Otto calls it the mysterious tremendum, this terrible mystery which draws us to it, but sometimes also beautiful and blissful, more typically. How do we make sense of that reality with our everyday reality, which seems to be humdrum and dry and separate and not unitive moments of ecstasy, contemplation, or visionary? And the theories that we build to try and bridge those two realities are our unitive theories. And they are our stories, our mythologies, our theologies, our metaphysics, our theosophies, our sciences, our attempts to try and make sense of reality as we see it, with reality as we experienced it in moments of deepest clarity. And in the moments of those clarity, we feel that we are more awake, more alive, more experiencing reality than we ever did in our ordinary waking moments. What William James calls that which is separated by the thinnest of veils, these experiences without which no account of the universe can be considered complete. And if I start to tell you some of these theories, you recognize that they all have a very basic, similar structure and shape, and whether they're from the East or the West or ancient or modern, typically they consist of some sort of grand chain of being, a term which was labeled and studied by Lovejoy, Arthur Lovejoy, in his book, The Great Chain of Being, the very first work of history, of ideas, the book which brought that field into existence. And the idea that he studies in that book is the Great Chain of Being, this notion that there's a chain from the One, as the Neoplatonists call it, from Ein Sof, as the Kabbalists call it, from the Godhead, as the Christian mystics call it, from the Brahman, and goes on, to our reality as we have it here, going through a series of emanations, where the One emanates itself and multiplies itself into the world we have it, which Martin Buber touched upon in his early definition, his early myth of mysticism. And Lovejoy, in his study, shows that this idea is pervasive in all cultures and all times. Another author who's brought this message home is Ken Wilber, a complicated figure and philosopher, but as well someone who studied the ubiquity of these theories of unity, these what we call in Kabbalah the Seder Stalschluss, and what we call in English the Great Chain of Being. That's number 2. So unitive experiences is number 1, unitive theories number 2, and number 3 is going to be unitive practices. Unitive practices we can split into 2 again. And I know that I'm talking about unity and here I am splitting things up, but we're doing this to give names, to understand, so that we can step back and see the big picture united. Experience, theory, practice. Practice, I said we're going to divide into 2. There are the techniques, and then there are the ethics. The techniques are the practices which we engage with to try and bring us into a space where we are open to that experience of unity, We cannot force the experience. We can only open ourselves to the grace of the experience, to use a Christian term. We can only open us to the possibility that God will bestow the unity upon us, to use a theistic term. The experiences include things, the techniques rather, include things like meditation, contemplation, prayer, worship, solitude, wandering, chanting, reading, bodily movements, breathing techniques, certain ways of dieting and fasting, all the use of certain intoxicants. These are all techniques which have been cultivated over millennia to bring us those experiences. And every mystical tradition has its own unique set of techniques which they have become geniuses at honing to their finest. We have them in Judaism, although they're a bit repressed in this moment. Perhaps the work that's happening here at this wonderful gathering, this wonderful festival, will try and bring those techniques to the fore again. And that is one half of practice. The second half of practice is the ethics, the way that we live our lives, knowing what we now know and experience what we now experienced. And the ethic is the ethic of all mystics. It's the ethics of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, the prophets of the Tanakh, who come to the Jewish people after having experienced what seems to be their own mystical experiences of unity with the divine, and they cannot put into words. The word burns within them, as Modern Buber writes, quoting the prophet Jeremiah. The word burns within him. And all he can come and say is, you guys are missing the point. You think God wants your sacrifices, you think God wants your Shabbat and your Yom Tov. This is what the prophet says. This is the sacred words, the words of God in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. The prophet says, what I want your heart. I want you to care. I want you to care for the oppressed and the downtrodden, the neglected and the marginalized, for the widow, for the child, for the foreigner, for the convert. These people that need your compassion. That is what God wants to see, because God, if we believe that God is existence itself and God is one, and therefore existence is one, and we are one in that unitive experience, in that unitive theory, in that unitive understanding, then there's no way that we can oppress the other, for the other is but an extension of us, an extension of God. And that is what the ethic of the mystic is, that v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, you must love the other as yourself, kamecha, because the other is yourself. The other is an extension of the divine just as you are. They are yitzir kapo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they are the handiwork, the tzelem elikim, the face of God. And whether they are Jewish or Muslim or Christian or black or gay or Norwegian or Palestinian or Australian, they are the face of God, and we must approach them as such with compassion and dignity and love and respect, as we would want ourselves to be treated and as we come to God to be treated. St. Francis of Assisi says in one of his beautiful poems that a poor person, a beggar, came to the door knocking for alms, for money, for bread, for food. And Francis opened the door and says, "What can I do for you? What can I get you?" And God responds to St. Francis, "What I need is your love, just your love." St. Francis here sees the face of God in the face of the beggar. And just your love doesn't mean give me a hug and let me starve. If you really love someone, you don't let them starve. You want to see them flourish, and their pain is your pain, and their success and their happiness is your success and your happiness. That is what love means. Love is thrown around too easily in a hippy-dippy kind of way that love solves everything. Love means, love obligates us. Love, v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, obligates us to treat the other with the ethic that the other demands. It treats us, it obligates us into justice. Getting carried away here. Mysticism, Bernard McGinn, another great scholar of mysticism who's in the middle of writing the definitive history of Christian mysticism from pre-Christianity until today. It's a multiple lifetime achievement. A brilliant, beautiful scholar writes that mysticism is, and he's writing in a Western Abrahamic context, and this definition may not fit for the East as some of the early definitions may fit a bit more universally. He writes, but he does add something important here, and I want to read it for that reason. He writes that mysticism, thank you, is the God-human encounter. Like we've been saying, God defined as reality itself. It is the encounter, the unity with reality. Mysticism is the God-human encounter, and he uses encounter as opposed to union for his own particular reasons. I recommend reading him to see why he does that. And everything which leads up to it prepares for it, and everything which flows from it. So namely what we said earlier, the practices, the techniques which bring us up to that experience, the study, the contemplation, the silence, the prayer, the worship, the dance, the ecstasy, everything that brings us up to that moment is part of the path of mysticism. It's a process. It's not a moment, but it's an ongoing process. And everything which flows from it. What are the feelings? What are the obligations? What are the ethics? What is the therapy that comes out of those moments? Those are all part of the process of mysticism, as Bernard McGinn puts it. As the experiences which dissolve, as we've been saying, the boundaries of duality, those of subject and object. And this expansion and dissolution can happen in two directions. It can either be an expansion outwards, where we see the self transposed upon the entire world. And this can be a form of megalomania, but if it's a self which demands us to treat the rest of existence as we like ourselves to be treated, then it is not megalomania. That is the mystical. Or it can be a collapsing of self, where there simply, and this we see in Buddhism, for example, where there simply is no self. There's anatman. Everything is just constantly arising spontaneously from the void and returning to the void. But from that space, where we come to identify the rest of existence as also none other than the none other, to quote Nicholas of Cusa. To widen our circle of identity, or to destroy it completely. Now, you should not try this at home. Do not try and destroy your identity without a lot of preparation, and without a very healthy sense of self, and without a strong support group. Do not go about destroying your don't go back and kill your ego. That's not the point of this talk. The point is that that's a possibility which a lifetime of practice and worship and devotion and love and tenderness may allow us to unpack the self, to dismantle the narrative of self, which it really is narrative. Scientifically, the self is a narrative which we're telling ourselves to constantly remind us that the self exists, because empirically there is no self. This is what David Hume calls the self is simply the bundle of sensations, the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. That is one way to slowly, to not implode, but to slowly deconstruct the self. And the other is to widen our circle of identity. And we do this naturally. We widen our circle of identity from ourselves to the things around us. If someone takes an object that belongs to us, we can feel that we've been personally implied or hurt in that moment, because it is part of our identity. And we expand our circle of identity in an evolutionary process, where we begin by identifying with just one simple tribe, one simple clan, which historically doesn't exceed much more than 50 people. And as we move historically, we develop new stories, new narratives. From a tribe, we have a few tribes together in a clan. From that, we come to city-states. From that, we come to nations. And from nations, which we are at that current circle of identity, expanding an incredible feat that we feel patriotic with millions of people. There's a sense of commonality. You meet a fellow landsman in a random country across the world, and you feel like there's some sort of shared identity. How is that? That's done through hundreds of years and millions of dollars of propaganda to expand that identity of self. And it might not be a bad thing, but if it's done in a way that's oppositional and excludes people, and it makes the other, the demon, the enemy, the subhuman, then we have a problem. There was a comic during World War II which was circulating. I don't know the backstory of the comic, but the final frame of the comic was this person reports back to the general and says, "General," they go on some sort of espionage mission. They say, "General, we have seen the enemy, and he is us." There's no enemy out there. The line between good and evil, writes Dostoevsky, goes down the heart of every single person. So let us stop. What's the word I'm looking for? Enemizing, alienating, seeing the enemy as something outside of us. It's not true. We can expand our circle of identity. We've done it historically. We used to only identify with our tribe, with our family, with our nation state. Now with our nation. The next step is to identify with a global identity, a global consciousness, a Gaia consciousness, it's called in hippie circles, where we can see that we are one with all of existence, with all of humanity, with all of life on this beautiful, tiny, fragile planet, a blue, tiny marble hurling through space that could be destroyed at any moment by an asteroid, by a meteor, or by stupid humans. We're doing a good job. If we can expand our circle of identity, we can expand our circle of care, our circle of responsibility, our circle of commitment, our circle of love, our circle of justice to include the rest of existence. And it's just a switch of story. When we look at the mystics across the world traditions, we see them telling us this story. We see them, as William James puts it, as the people who are in a current state of identification. They're yes, living in a nation state or in a tribe or in a nation, but they see the story, they see ahead, they see where we're going. There was another great Canadian psychologist or psychiatrist back in the 1800s. I'm trying to remember his name. He wrote a book on mysticism. He writes this very strange theory which doesn't really get accepted scholarly by anyone, and it gets ignored historically by and large. He speaks of the mystics as part of this process of evolution. This was the heyday of Darwinism, and everything had to be interpreted according to Darwin's theory of evolution. And he says the mystic is... There's something a bit uncomfortable with his expression here, and let's remember when he's writing back in the 1800s. But the mystic seems to be the more evolved human, and I think this is problematic because I don't want to be separating people into more and less evolved. I think that there are moments in our lives where we have greater clarity and lesser clarity, and that applies to all of us. But anyhow, he sees the mystic as the one who is evolved to a state of wider identification, and they simply see that reality, and that's what they're calling their entire lives as people. See that you are one with the rest of existence. See that it is not separate from you. If we look across the mystical traditions, we do see a commonality of narrative. We see the belief in the possibility of the encounter, the presence, participation, union, communion, or identity with reality itself, with what some call God, what others call Allah, others call Ein Sof, others call Brahman. We see across the mystics that they believe that the true nature of reality is non-dual or fundamentally unified, interdependent, and connected, beyond all dichotomies of time and space, subject and object, good and evil, language and logic. We see the belief, the unanimous belief, that this experience and identity and truth cannot be communicated. It's ineffable, as we began by saying, nor can it be discovered discursively, but only through a direct experience or awakening of consciousness to this reality, through a transformative process which may incorporate a variety of practices, techniques, rituals, or disciplines, as we began by saying, whereby the previous, egoic, separate conception of self and reality, often depicted in religious literature as a state of concealment, confusion, illusion, trance, sleep, or forgetfulness of our true selves, of our true reality, our true nature, those are dissolved, and a new, unified, sometimes even deified concept of self and reality is reborn. The process by which the sense of separation is lost and the unitive, the absolute, is found. A process which ideally, and if it's not, check that something wasn't check what happened. A process which ideally leads to an increase in feelings of bliss and acceptance, selflessness, love, and compassion. This vision of reality, which Aldous Huxley spent much of his life trying to promote, and he writes that this ultimate reality is not clearly and immediately apprehended except by those who have made themselves loving, pure in heart, and poor in spirit. It takes not just philosophy and not just words and not just rhetoric, but it takes avodah, as we say in Chassidus. It takes work of purifying ourselves to be more loving, to be kinder, to be poorer, to be broken. And echoing here in the words of the prophet Isaiah, who says that in the words of God says, all of the world is my dwelling place. Hashamayim kisi va'aretz hadimragli. The world itself, the universe is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house, what kind of home can you build for me speaking to the king who's trying to build a temple, a home for God. He mocks the king and says, what kind of home can you build for an infinite being who rests his feet on the earth? What a great image. And God answers the rhetorical question to this poor king who's just trying to build a home for God, and he probably has enough problems dealing with Jews trying to raise money in politics and people who don't like him. And now he has God in his case as well. And God in God's infinite kindness answers the question and says that I will not dwell in a home of stone and wood, but I will dwell in the heart of one who is broken in spirit and humbled before me. Elo anion che ruach, one who is poor and of a neche is hard to translate into English, but a low spirit. No, not low in a negative sense, but low in a humble spirit. We spend so much time fighting over stones and walls and rocks and things which are not the dwelling place of God. God, according to God, in the words of the Holy Bible, dwells in the heart of the human who's humble, who's contrite. And don't think I'm a contrite and humble human. Not. But we can speak this into reality, and we can change ourselves. We don't have to be perfect or good to be able to share goodness, but the goodness that we share can come back and be infectious and bite us, and that's why I talk about these things, because I'm sure I can do with some of that. There's a great story of two people that are fighting over a plot of land, something which we see all too much of these days, unfortunately. And one of them says, the land belongs to me, and the other one says, the land belongs to me, echoing, the famous Mishnah, Shnaimer's and Metalos, Zerimer, Chati Shliv, Zemer Chatzli. This one says half is mine, this one says half is mine. So this one says the land belongs to me, and this one says the land belongs to me. And then they hear a murmuring, almost coming from the land itself, and they bend down to listen to what the land is saying. The land is speaking. The land says, both you and you, both belong to me. We come from the earth, and it is to the earth that we return. And it is a short moment that we live on this land, on this earth. And it is our choice. Do we want to make this moment a moment of separation, alienation, pain, enemies, fear, anger, constriction? Is that the life we want to live? Or do we want to open ourselves to the earth, open ourselves to be one with her, to be one with everyone who comes from her and returns to her? That's the choice. Do we want to engage in a metaphysics of separation, alienation, or a metaphysics of dissolution, of co-creation, of interconnectivity and interbeing? And if we do want the latter, there are many, many great metaphysicians who have done this work explaining why this is a rational narrative to believe, one which coheres with the best of our science, the best of our empirical data. And whether that be ancient metaphysicians like Shankara, Ibn Arabi, Al-Ghazali, or more modern people like Spinoza and Whitehead and James, they exist out there. And head over to Seekers of Unity, where we explore all of them at great length. We're doing a series now, Maimonides, another great metaphysician, and maybe even a mystic, although people don't know that about him. We're busting the secret open. I could go on and on and on, but maybe I'll end with this one quote, and we'll have reached a good time, and then we'll open to some questions, if people can ask questions. I'd love that. This quote comes from not a particularly religious fellow as we can typically conceive of religion, but deep down he was a religious person, a person who was smitten by the metaphysics of Spinoza, one of the great beautiful humans and mystics of our history, who we as Jews ought to reclaim. This man's name, should I tell you before or after the quote? After, okay. He writes like this. And by the way, I'm quoting a lot of men here, but there are also a lot of incredible women mystics, and we have a video on the channel looking at just Jewish women mystics, but in all traditions, whether that's someone like a Simone Weil, or that's someone like a Teresa of Avila, of the great teacher of John of the Cross, or someone like Etty Hillesum, who we speak about as well in the video, or someone like Mechtil of Magdeburg, who I don't know how to pronounce her name. Check out your local brilliant woman mystic as well, because it's not just a man's game. we got to bring some women into the conversation as well, because men have been dominating the conversation for a while, and it doesn't look like we're doing much good. So we may have to step aside a little and let some women speak. And if you are a woman and you have some mysticism to share with the world, I would like to personally invite you to come to my channel, Seekers of Unity, for you to have the stage and mic to share your thoughts. And that's an open, standing invitation. You heard it here first. Back to the quote. A human being is a part of the whole, called by us the universe. A human being is a part of the whole, called by us the universe. A part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of our consciousness. I'll give you a hint. This guy is a scientist that's writing. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affections for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison, this is what we're talking about here, by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Putting very eloquently and simply in one sentence what I've been trying to say for close to an hour. Nobody's able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such an achievement is in itself a part of the liberation and a foundation for inner peace and security. The man who said this was Albert Einstein, who is well known for his messy hair and for his theorem of general relativity. So, what are we waiting for? Let us let ourselves out of the prison. The great Sufis write that we are sitting in the prison and the prison is not even locked. We're welcome to stand up and leave at any time. And those who stay inside are sadly the most imprisoned, because there's nothing holding them back at all. Nothing holding me back, nothing holding you back, nothing holding us back from stepping out. I had a whole other part of this class here about some notes about what this might mean for religion and how we can do religion differently and what the Kabbalists say about this and the Kabbalist version of the story. But I'm going to skip that for now, and we can do that another time. And I'd like to end with a quote from a woman, the American anthropologist Margaret Mead. I hope people know this quote because it is a really beautiful one, both because it's inspirational and because it's factual. Unlike someone like Victor Hugo, who talks about that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come, or there's nothing like a dream to create the future. Utopia today, flesh and blood tomorrow. These are beautiful, inspiring ideas, but who says that they're true? Margaret Mead, a scientist, an anthropologist, writes, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed, caring citizens can change the world." And here she speaks as an anthropologist and as a historian when she says, "Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And with that, I thank you for joining us. Keep seeking.